Thank you, Dr. Chang, and I'm delighted to be here. I love to come to Korea, and the last few years I've been coming regularly, and I appreciate the tremendous warm hospitality of everyone here. Charles talked about a history from 65 million years ago. If you'll pardon me, I'm going to start a little earlier than that, 4.5 billion years. 4.5 billion years ago, we basically started our evolution, and somewhere along the line, about 60, 70 million years ago, our plants were converted gradually into fossil fuels. But this evolution just continued and continued, and about roughly 10,000 years ago, we entered a new geological era called the Holocene, during which most of human history is concentrated. Most of the things that we think of as being human. But you know, in the last 200 years, we've entered a whole new geological period, which is now called the Anthropocene. Literally, in 200 years, we have done in evolution almost as much as 4.5 billion years did before us. You know, this is the first time in the history of the planet that one species can change the face of the Earth, can actually bring life on Earth to an end. We, human beings, are now in a position to transform this planet from a live, beautiful, creative, planetary being, Gaia, into a dead piece of rock. Literally in a few days, we could just do that. With our technologies, with our resources, it's possible for us to do anything. We can do all sorts of good, but we can also do all sorts of bad. Part of this is because of the growth of population, and as you see here, almost all of it has happened in the last 150 years of growth. Literally 200 years ago, there were less than 1 billion people. Today, we're getting on from 7 to 8, and possibly, if the United Nations statistics are right, on to 9 and 10 and 10 and a half. Not only are we growing in numbers, but we're growing in our activities. The GDP growth of the world has gone up exponentially. And as you can see, the bulk of it has gone up in the last 50, 60 years. We're shifting to an urbanized world. We're all moving into cities. By the middle of the century, 70% of them, 7 out of 10 human beings will be living in cities. And we have a gross inequity in this world. Our world is very unfair. This is a diagram from the cover of the United Nations Human Development Report in 1990, which is what, about 24 years ago? 1990, the first Human Development Report reported that we live in a world that is like a champagne glass. 20% of the people in the world were getting roughly 85% of the income of the world. Now that was bad enough. I used to go around the world saying, wow, isn't this incredibly bad? But in those 24 years, we got much worse. Now we don't talk about 20%. We don't even talk about 1%. Now we're talking about 0.1%, 1 person in 1,000, and sometimes I hear stories about the 0.01%. This is an enormously unequal world, one that is, in fact, going to commit suicide because of that inequality. Just look at the way our material and energy resources are growing. Each country is plotted, and you can see on the vertical scale the metabolic rate, if you like, the amount of materials we use, and the energy graph is very similar. And on the bottom is a logarithmic scale for GDP. So it never turns down. The richer we get, the more we use. And the different regions are, of course, very different. This is a map of the world with energy, material use. The blue signs are 1990, the red signs are 2007. And you can see very big variations. The human figures are per capita, the bars are absolute numbers. So you can tell from here what is happening, and in some parts it's growing very rapidly. And material use of materials requires energy. The more materials you use, the more energy you need. And you plot those, you get the red one, which is the material use, the blue ones, which are energy use, and you can see it is going up inexorably by the year. We're starting only in 1900. This is just a matter of a century, and you can see that it's grown up hugely. Now, I'm not as apologetic as Charles. Even the chairman of the largest oil company, Exxon, admits to peak oil. There's nobody who's denying peak oil. And most people recognize that we may already have gone over the hump. New oil discoveries are coming in very slowly, and the few so-called unorthodox ones, tar sands and shale, etc., are going to be very limited. It's really only people with their heads in the clouds who think that's going to buy much time. It may buy you extra 10 years, maybe 20 years, that's it. And you can see why. Because all the low-hanging fruit is gone. The cheap oil, the cheap gas, the cheap fossil fuels have already been taken. Now it's becoming more and more difficult and expensive, and it's called the energy cliff. In 1930, it took 1 barrel of oil to get 100 out. Today, it takes 3 barrels. It takes 1 barrel of oil to get 3 barrels out. So we're going rapidly down this cliff, and within a decade, 2 decades, it will cost you 1 barrel to get 1 barrel out. So you can imagine how we're going to do it. And it's not just oil or gas. It's also food production. People in the last 7 years have been rioting in the streets of many countries. Governments have fallen because of the food prices. Topsoil, going. Phosphorus, without which you cannot grow food, almost gone. Yeah, maybe we have 40 years, 50 years to go, but what about our children? What about their children? According to the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, we have 60% of our fisheries in total state of collapse. Water, we already heard about that, and many other things. This is a place my organization works in the central part of India. This used to be, 40 years ago, a lush teak and bamboo forest. You couldn't walk in there, it was too thick. That's what it looks like now. The world is growing 50,000 square kilometers of deserts every year, according to the UN Environment Program. I talked about food prices already, and you can see, for centuries and centuries, decades and decades, the food price was almost constant. Since 2006, it's gone completely wild. And same applies to resource prices. Resources were coming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper till the year 2000, and now they're going up. And every time, like the last few months, they come down a bit, everybody's so happy. But they're going to be down for long. They are going up because we're using more and more of them, and it's getting harder and harder to get them. The Earth is not going to run out of resources. I don't think there's any resource that the Earth's crust is going to get run out of, but it's going to be harder to get. And so you have to understand that we are in a state of transition. Those 200 years that have brought us to here, and the next 20 years, which are going to take us from here to there, are going to be tough for our children, not to mention ourselves. This is a theory that we've developed called the ecological rucksack. When you dig out material out of the earth, you basically have to move a lot of material. If you want, for example, a gold ring, let's say it weighs 20 grams, actually it weighs 20 tons. That's the amount of material you have to use in order to make that ring. And then there's a second thing called the ecological footprint. Maybe most of you have heard about that. I don't need to go into detail, but in a sense, it's the amount of land that each one of us has available to support us. You can also do it as a ratio, the ratio of how much land there is to how much we're using. In the old days, around the time of the Korean War, our global ecological footprint was about 0.3. That means we were using 1/3 as much land as was available to produce sustainable outcomes for us. By the year 2000, we were up to 1.5. We were using 50% more land than Mother Earth gave us. And by the year 2050, we will be needing 2.5, 3 Earths in order to support the population of this planet. 2.5, 3 times. That means we're inexorably going to have to change our ways. And the problem is that it's not just an ecological footprint, it's an economic and political bootprint. Because when people are rich, they get what they want and leave everybody else to fend for themselves. Plundering is an economic activity which has been going on forever and ever, and we now have to recognize that we're in a new world where people are not willing to accept that. We have a consumption society. You can see the pictures. We live very well, thank you. We have nice shopping malls. There's a family in Germany whose food for the week is shown in that picture. They spend around $1,000 equivalent per week on food, and luckily for them, otherwise they'd be in hospital, they waste 40% of it. 17% of that food is thrown away unopened because of expiry dates. But then there is another part of the world, that's called the subsistence society. That's how they live, that's how they work, bring their fuel and food and water, and that's how much food this family in Central Africa has for a week. So we've got a problem, and we plotted that problem on a chart where we have the ecological footprint, of course that should be minimized, and the Human Development Index, of course that should be maximized. Ideally, you should be in the top left-hand corner. Not a single country in the world has been able to get there. Cuba came close, but virtually no one else. So we have to bring the rich countries over here back to left and the very poor countries to the top before the world will support all of us. And it's going to happen only by bringing those who use too much, the people who suffer from a very nasty disease called affluenza. It's a terminal disease, and affluenza, it can only be solved by taking away a little bit of that gross amount of stuff that we're absorbing. And it's not just the rich countries, it's the rich and the poor countries too. I mean, don't get me wrong, we've got a massive global problem, which Professor Halal talked about yesterday, of a total breakdown in value systems. But the poor consume too little. They cannot, at the moment, even survive. In my country, there are 300 or 400 million people who are chronically hungry every night. We're talking about a world that is grossly unacceptable. So they have to go up a little bit. But maybe, if we're clever, oops, it's gone. If we're clever, we may even be able to learn how to tunnel through. My tunneling thing is gone. But basically, in this unfair world, you see here, for example, do you recall this picture? It's right outside here. 1,000 lights. 1,000 lights on every tree. Not bad. But then you must remember that these girls don't have even one light. They have to dream of their future by sitting under the tree during the daytime to be able to learn. Each one of those 1 million lights outside this hotel could give one girl a chance to become who? A Marie Curie? A Madame Park? We don't know, because she never had a chance. So it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they're poor because they don't work, they don't have, and of course Korea understands this. In 25, 30 years, you've been through all this. And you know that it takes a whole national effort to be able to do that. So I have been working in a UN organization. I chair something called the International Resource Panel, which is basically like IPCC, but for resources. And we've produced a lot of reports, and we're really promoting the idea of decoupling. You can improve your life as much as you want, but you don't have to use resources as much as you want. You have to decouple. In the case of the world today, there is a little bit of decoupling going on. We are improving GDP, HDI, whatever else, and resources are going up more slowly, but they're still going up. What we have to do is to bring about absolute decoupling and make the world a better place without having to keep raping Mother Earth. And you can see that our resource productivity is going up. It's not something that we should be unproud of, but it's not enough. This is called the Kuznets curve, and most countries go through this, from being poor and clean to being rich and dirty, and then spending the money to clean up, and then they are supposed to end up rich and clean. But unfortunately, as I showed you earlier in that graph of material use, we're not turning around. We're going on up and up. And so we now have to figure out a way to turn this curve down or tunnel through. And to do that, you've got to basically get out of business as usual, because that's going to land up in a crazy place where none of us will live. And incremental change, fine-tuning, isn't going to be enough. We heard yesterday about disruption. What was disruption? It's about deep change and structural transformation. It's about bringing about a world in which you are able to understand all the systems linkages, which are very complex, environment and poverty and material use and jobs and health and everything else, and you've got to figure that out. And then you start decoupling. Now, my colleague, co-chair of the resource panel, Professor Weizsäcker from Germany, he and I have been working on this for the last 7 years. His question is the following. If 7 billion people on this planet, if it were to become a fair place, had the footprint of the US, then frankly we would need 5 planet Earths. 5 planet Earths isn't going to be available. You can't go and sit in Mars and hope to make a living there. But we have only one. So his contention is that we've got to bring down our energy use and material use by at least a factor of 5, if not more. And he's even written a book, which is available in the Korean language. It's a very well-known book called The Factor 5. Now, one of the most remarkable things about Factor 5 is that this is the agricultural systems that we all depend on. This is where our parents and grandparents used to be. The farmers of the early part of the 20th century used to put in 1 calorie of inanimate energy, mechanical energy, or whatever, into the farm, and they got 50 calories out of food energy. Why? Because the sun was doing the work for them. Gradually, in the space of 6-7 decades, we've come over to the greenhouses, the supermarkets, where we are putting in 500 calories in to get 1 calorie out. Now tell me, why should we be sitting here in Seoul in a big meeting like this talking about energy efficiency when we're killing ourselves? Does that make sense? You're converting petroleum into food. No wonder we're running short. There is no way that today's agricultural systems, let alone industrial systems, I'm just giving you examples because I've got literally 1 minute to go. And we have to change the way we design our cities. Look at Seoul. Well, look at Atlanta. Look at Barcelona. Same number of people, 2.8 million people. But one is completely driven by cars. The other one has shared bicycles. This is Copenhagen. Copenhagen is consistently voted one of the most livable cities in the world, and it has more bicycles than people. It's a cold place. So we talked about renewable energy. Just a few more slides quickly. This is about biomimicry, how to learn from nature the engineering principles by which she produces virtually no waste and has everything operating at ambient temperatures and pressures. Nature doesn't need big refineries. It does everything in an ecological system, which industries could do. So we learn a lot. This is a termite hill. Inside it, to protect the queen termite, they maintain the temperature at a constant 24 degrees. That building in Harare in Zimbabwe was built on termite principles, has no air conditioners. The most valuable real estate in Southern Africa. You can learn from nature on how to make better cars. You can learn from nature. This is my company's headquarters in New Delhi. It's by far the greenest building in the world because it uses virtually no construction materials other than recycled materials and industrial wastes. It's made out of fly ash from thermal power stations, recycled materials, and so on. And this is a power station that we build. We have many of these. We build them in small villages using weeds. Weeds as our source. Solar, wasteland development, bringing back those deserts into forests, making them into forests, very cheap. Keep all the water in, contour a trench, keep the cattle out. Within 15 months, you got a forest. Check dams. These are our answer to the big dams. These have a return on investment of more than 1,000% per year. These are dams that I'm almost finished. Cook stoves, because the poor women in villages have to cook every day, and they waste a lot of fuel, and we make efficient stoves. There's a handmade recycled paper unit, which exports large quantities of paper. What I'm wearing is made by these people here using looms that we developed, which are very high tech, but use no energy, use no electricity. So building materials made of mud, like this one. We use virtually no steel or cement except in a few columns, and no wood, no bricks, and it's a building that multinationals are happy to want to rent. Operating energy, embodied energy, all 30–40% less. So here are the systemic issues that all of us need to understand. We need to fulfill the basic needs of everyone in the world and yet protect the environment. We need to look at the production systems and the consumption patterns all together. We need to bring northern concerns, the rich country concerns, which includes this country, together with the imperatives of survival in the poor countries. And we've got to create sustainable jobs and sustain our resources at the same time. Thank you.